Lisa was very specific in telling me what she wanted me to talk about. She asked me to talk about how do you move research into implementation. Your group has been, so far, you have really been very successful in getting research through the NCHRP process. You really have. I do want you to know that these things do come in kind of cycles, and once people start noticing that you've had 4 projects in the last 3 years, you might expect a slight relocation of funds for a while, but nevertheless, if you don't put your fishing line in the water, you're guaranteed to lose the fishing competition. So you just need to keep putting your line in the water. But the question is, now what? Now you have these 4 research projects, or within a few years you're going to have a whole bunch of nice big thick volumes about equipment research. Now what? And I think I found this quote that I thought really says a lot. A little knowledge that acts is worth infinitely more than much knowledge that is idle. If you take that research and you put it on your bookshelf, it is serving a purpose in holding your bookshelf down against the forces of flying into the universe, but it is not accomplishing its goal at all. So we need to try and really get research into practice. And this really ties to the keynote presentation as well, because all innovation goes through this process where you have to reach implementation. What we've been doing historically has been dissemination. We just talk about it. Yak, 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 yak. And within, 15 minutes, 3/4 of you will have tuned out the message, and you will be working on your emails or jotting a note of things that you need to do, or otherwise moving on with business. Dissemination has its place. What are some examples? That report that you're going to get for your research project. This presentation is one example. A webinar, small group training. We've all been to dissemination type activities. Implementation is much more complicated. It's much more difficult. You have to use a bunch of different strategies to integrate a new approach into your practice. You have to both accept the results of the research and take action. It's an active type of activity. And I love this particular little clip note. Change is good, you go first. Somebody has to go first. And so those are going to be the people who are the implementers. Why is this such a problem? I mean, this whole business, we've been doing research for years, hundreds of years probably. The researchers, the people doing the research project, the program developers, the people like you who are sitting at the table, and the citizens, and heavens knows our politicians, nobody thinks it's their job to implement. It should be done for them. It should be made easy for them. Somebody else is responsible. And I guess what I'm telling you is, unless you personally take that responsibility, it won't happen. And I also like this particular, the alphabet soup, I like this particular one. It seemed like a good idea at the time. That could go for so many things on why we do things the way we do. So we have to get away from that. And so I have a couple of these kinds of things. We need to make the right thing to do also the easy thing to do. We have to make it easier to do the right thing. And then that passive approach, let's just train them. That's really train and pray. We train and then we go home and we just pray that it actually happens. And there's been a lot of research on research, and that research shows that this approach does not work. So Lisa asked for this topic, so I being from an old research mode myself, I did some research on research, and there's a lot of stuff that's been written on this in the medical field. Because the medical industry, they do all their clinical trials, and then they found this huge long lag time before anything gets into practice. So they have a whole field that is this implementation piece. So what they came up with was a bunch of strategies that you need to do all of them in order to really get something implemented. The first one, and these are in their order, not my order. The first one used evaluative and interactive strategies. I just said, oh my gosh, they're going to just, that'll be the end of this presentation. I'll come back to that one at the very end. Provide interactive assistance. That is, use a peer-to-peer so that you can talk to a peer to find out their answer to a particular problem, or hire a consultant who is essentially in charge of facilitating implementation for all of you. That model is exactly what they used for the SHARP 2 process. They hired consultants for each of the big program categories, and their job was to work with states to implement. Just so you know, the green part are the parts where I know there's been direct parallels into DOT life, so I've written those they're highlighted in green. The adapt and tailor to context, that is the reason why we have regional partnerships instead of one big national. There are regional differences. You all were talking about the anti-icing. It's not such a big issue in the southeast, but in other areas there are different problems. So there are these localized adaptations and tailoring that need to happen. Develop stakeholder interrelationships. You already are interrelated with all the other partnerships, and you'll get together next year at your National Equipment Management Conference. Those interrelationships matter. But in addition, you could ask SCOM, as part of your equipment management technical working group, is that what they call it? You could have one of your little task groups in there to be an implementation task force, so that implementation of research remains one of your action items. This group could have an implementation task group if it wished. Next, train and educate stakeholders. This is, in fact, the dissemination piece that we're usually pretty darn good at. Engineers really like this kind of stuff. Webinars, peer-to-peer exchanges, presentations. Did you know, though, that if you submit a TRB webinar idea, TRB prioritizes at the top those that are based on NCHRP projects. So your chances of getting a webinar through TRB are much greater if you suggest one based on one of their reports. And you have, 3 or 4 coming out really soon. Next, support implementers. We're not so good at this. We haven't historically done this, but there are some examples. I didn't list them here. But you get a small group started. That small group helps each other along the way. You learn what works and what doesn't work, and success gets to be contagious. It is catching. This one, you engage your target audience. You all know what each other needs, pretty much. It's not uniform, but you have a good idea. what would it take to make Steve make a change? What would it take to make Jeff make a change? You have to ask that question. If you don't ask the question, the answer will be Steve is up to his eyeballs in work on his desk. He has other things to deal with, and he won't bother to tell you why he's not implementing until somebody asks. So you can do that through surveys, from peer-to-peer exchanges, from a whole variety of mechanisms, but somebody needs to be asking the questions. This is one where it's very difficult for DOTs utilize financial strategies. In the medical field, they have no problem whatsoever with paying people to implement. It is not contrary. If they can convince a practice of doctors that a particular treatment is effective, they can pay them money and include up the ante for them toward implementation. Engineering, not so much. In DOT life, not at all. I mean, you know, this is the stuff that makes the front page headlines and people lose their jobs over. So I'm not coming here telling you we're going to be able to get incentivized everything, all aspects of implementation. But there are things where you can get support and you can ask for money. And one of those is once you get this small group of implementers, you can ask Federal Highway Administration at your local district level to fund a peer-to-peer exchange, and they fund them all the time. I've been on, when I was with DOT, I went on 4 of them. Just little regional things. It really helps. The ones I was on were related to pavement management and to automated distress data collection. But, you know, that's a funding mechanism that many states are not aware that they can ask for that money. They may even pay to have somebody facilitate, take the notes, write a report for you. Another one that's difficult in state agency is the idea of changing your infrastructure. The only way infrastructure gets reorganized in DOTs seems to coincide with the election of a new governor. So, but we sometimes do recognize that there are some barriers in our organizational structure that are keeping things from being done, from getting done. And if you can identify those, you frequently can make the case up your food chain to get some things reassigned, maybe, is the better way to put it. And now back to that very first one, this evaluative and iterative strategies. Basically, they're saying you get together your group, you find out what works, you identify what didn't work, and you take that off the plate, and then you keep improving the process over time. Each time you hit a little roadblock, you make a little modification, and you move the thing forward. What could you consider? There are ideas you can consider. NCHRP does have a very limited amount of money for implementation. You can submit for funding for an implementation project. I'm going to tell you right now it's a low probability of success, but it's certainly worth a try. You can create an implementation task group at SCOM, the Subcommittee on Maintenance. I think that's an easy win. I think that one is one that shouldn't be so difficult. But the states that join that group really should be willing to step up and actually implement some of this work. And then the third thing is, I think what really should be first, you need to spend time studying the research report. Now, I am here to tell you that reading research reports is right up there as a cure for insomnia against anything on the market. Nevertheless, When you're reading that report now, you're reading it as a potential implementer. You're not reading it to get the nuts and bolts of how many oils samples did Dr. Hildreth test. That's not your point. You're reading it now to say, what would it take for me to implement this in my agency, and writing those things down. What are the steps? Yeah, they identify the obstacles, determine if it's one of those things that's regional, or if it's just your state, or if it could be national. You need to have a leader and regular calls. It shouldn't be any mystery to you that about 90% of the work that's done in a committee is done the 2 days before a phone call where everybody has to report their progress. I mean, we're all busy. We all have plenty of things on our plate. But if you recognize that and you have regular phone calls, people will in fact spend that day before getting caught up and understand what they're going to report at that next call. And as soon as you have 3 or 4 agencies who have implemented, then ask for a peer-to-peer, so those 3 can visit 3 states each. It'll be a 1 to 3 peer, but that way suddenly you go from 3 states to 12 states as your potential implementers. You have to make presentations about the implementation, and you have to be honest. You have to tell the truth about what it took, both in resources, in time, in money, in changes to your process. If you're honest, people will be more likely to believe what you're saying. If it just seems like a bunch of hand waving, they're not gonna follow along. And then finally, you might host an implementation webinar to talk about, have those 4 people each talk about what were their issues and how they overcame them. And as more agencies implement, then the group just has to keep getting bigger and bigger, and then the strength comes from the number. Leading implementation is really hard work. It really is. While I was with NCDOT, we implemented in the Pavement Management Unit automated distress data collection. We used peer-to-peer trips with Virginia. We did data reviews. I personally viewed every mile of concrete video log for North Carolina to make sure that those numbers were agreeing with my assessment of what was happening in the field. So it takes a commitment. In addition, the pavement ME design, that was the biggest change in pavement design since 1976. So a huge change. That involved a lot of task force work, training within my agency and nationally, national webinars, many presentations. Every TRB for 6 years in a row, we had a workshop. Regional meetings, customer surveys, all kinds of different approaches. It's not easy, but it is very satisfying. You look back on your career and you say, we did something there. We really changed something. So, this is the little call to action instead of a conclusion. Read the report. The researcher will love you for it. Really, he will. And don't be shy. If you have questions, send him an email. God knows he wants to get some from somebody other than me. Right, John? Disseminate the findings. Yeah, do those webinars, do that information sharing, all that stuff. Create a group, work within your organization, share your results, improve the process, make it easier on the people behind you, and then expand the group. That's the whole process. I took the medical study, 10 items, shrunk it down to 6 items that are doable in every DOT. So if you have any questions, there's my email. That is not a mistake on the email. Michigan State University has a limit on how many digits, so they just cut off my name. And everybody thinks it's a mistyping. It is not, but feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments.
The preceding video was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found at tsp2.org. That's tsp2.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.